Unashamedly, in my paper today, I'm going to sort of present you a snapshot, or as much as time will allow, of the argument and wider exposition of Coleridge's work that I make in my new book, which is the publication of which is next week, in fact, officially. So it's coincided very happily with this conference. Now, while the term demonic has some pedigree and prior criticism in Coleridge, I derive what I mean by the demonic from Coleridge's own self-analysis in this particular notebook entry. And this notebook entry is a very rich one. It's sort of highly condensed, and it's largely escaped scholarly notice, curiously. But there, as I'll show in a moment, Coleridge defines the demonic by reference to his own fascination with what he calls the transnatural, a predilection that in turn instills in him the apprehension, he says, of being feared and shrunk from as a something transnatural. So the transnatural and the demonic involve each other here. And the transnatural, if you will, carries the promise and the risk of hidden orders of insight, being and knowledge, prescribed by contingent social and religious mores. And the demon is Coleridge's figure or image of a mind fascinated by the transnatural. That's essentially how he's using it. So Coleridge describes their fusion in the imaginative act as a moment of self-election, in which he writes, shame and power coincide, and he becomes, he writes in Greek, daimon, the demon. Now, the way he couples the demonic and the transnatural in this note of 1812 is idiosyncratic and provisional. It's not part of a consistently worked out, explicit philosophy. It's implicit, but it's not part of a consistently applied terminology throughout his work. Similarly, while Coleridge uses the Greek daimon, his meaning is not comprised by the Hellenic literature, in fact. Empedocles comes closest. For him, the demon was, in the words of E.R. Dodds, the carrier of man's potential divinity and actual guilt. For Empedocles, though, the demon was an indestructible migrant spirit, part of a specific religious philosophy of reincarnation. Consequently, the demonic implied a supervening force external to the will. And Dodd suggests that in its original usage, the Greek daimonios meant acting at the monition of a demon. Now, Coleridge does at times conceive the demonic as what he calls powers ab extra, powers from outside the self. And he sort of worries at this, worries that demonology would encourage a kind of delirious polytheism, where any number of things outside the self are treated as independent sources of divine law. He's very worried about that at various times. But in this more personal notebook entry that I refer to, though, Coleridge's daimon inverts the classical assumption. Instead of being acted upon by an external agency, Coleridge becomes the demon by a willing transition. Now, Coleridge's note signals an element of self-conscious moral heresy in his pursuit of the transnatural, and the history of the word itself conveys clues to the ambiguity he has in mind. The OED defines the transnatural as beyond the order of nature, more than natural, supernatural. And going back to the 16th century, it's a Latinate synonym of Coleridge's hobby horse, metaphysics. It's a rare word in 18th century literature, but like metaphysics, had acquired the tinge of transgression since the late 17th century, thanks to the rise of sceptical empiricism, typified for Coleridge, rightly or wrongly, by his philosophical bête noire, John Locke. Broadly speaking, Locke sought to exclude the transnatural from rational inquiry, because for him they surpassed the limits of empirical knowledge. Locke's epistemology sought to preserve a distinction between the knower and the known. But for Coleridge, such limitations excluded what I call the experiential authority of what he called spiritual truths, which, he says, we can only know by the act of becoming. And that process of becoming is central to Coleridge's mystery poems, the shorthand term I use for those extraordinary poems, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Kubla Khan, and Christabel. In each of those poems, a kind of gnosis, I'm using that term in the sense of the experience, or to denote the experience of knowing to which Coleridge refers. That kind of gnosis quickens physiological as well as psychological change. Coleridge's protagonists in the poems realise the law that he formulated of his own imagination in 1812 in this note, that to know the transnatural is to become transnatural. And so to that notebook entry on that handout, in the labyrinth of which lurks my meaning, he writes, "One of the strangest and most painful peculiarities of my nature, unless others have the same, and like me hide it from the same inexplicable feeling of causeless shame and sense of a sort of guilt, joined with the apprehension of being feared and shrunk from as a something transnatural, I will here record. And my motive, or rather impulse to do this, seems to myself an effort to eloign and abalienate it from the dark adit of my own being by a visual outness." It's joyous, isn't it? "And not the wish for others to see it. It consists in a sudden second sight of some hidden vice, past, present, or to come, of the person or persons with whom I am about to form a close intimacy, which never deters me, but rather, as all these transnaturals, urge me on, just like the feeling of an eddy torrent to a swimmer. I see it as a vision, feel it as a prophecy, not as one given me by any other being, but as an act of my own spirit, of the absolute noumenon, which in so doing seems to have offended against some law of its being, and to have acted the traitor by a commune with full consciousness, independent of the tenure or inflicted state of association, cause and effect," and so on and so on. "Thus it was," and here's a bit of code, "Theou gift tuum, and so Theou iram plus etolrach." We'll come to that in a second. And it is a sort of crucial bit, I suppose. These occasional acts of the ego numenos, spiritual self, equal repetitions or semblances of the original fall of man. Hence shame and power to leave the appointed station and become daimon. Now, that code I mentioned, which Coleridge often did in his notebooks when he was writing about sensitive material. Thus it was, Theou gift tuum. Now, Theou is simply with, and the disguised names are those of significant women in his life. Gift tuum is none other than Dorothy Wordsworth. Gift tuum being a half-English, half-Latin version of thy gift, doron, Greek for gift, and thy, Dorothai. See there? That's the way he's thinking. And Iram and Etolrach are Mary and Charlotte. They're Mary Morgan and Charlotte Brent, two sisters. Mary was married to Coleridge's friend John Morgan, and in 1812, when Coleridge wrote this note, the four of them were living together. So Coleridge indirectly tells us that he had this experience of second sight in relation to Dorothy, Mary and Charlotte, near the beginning of his intimacy with each. In Dorothy's case, this was 1797, a significant year in Coleridge's poetic history. That's when he started work on the mystery poems. He met Mary and Charlotte 10 years later, but that reveals that the kind of experience he describes in this note is a sort of constant theme of his psychic life, if you will. His strange visions involving these women, of which we could say much more, perhaps that's another question, were the rather guilty occasions that prompted him to write the note. But Coleridge's note moves from the specific form of one transnatural vision, what he describes in relation to them, that sudden second sight of hidden vice, into a more general commentary which treats that vision as one example of a wider pattern characteristic of his imagination. The vision urges him on, he says, as all these transnaturals do. Coleridge feels such impulses to be somehow transgressive. They prompt these feelings of causeless shame and a sort of guilt. And he suspects that if disclosed, his own fascination with these transnaturals would make him feared and shrunk from as a something transnatural.